Hello, and welcome to this presentation on assessment training for adjunct, concurrent, and new faculty. As an instructor at BRTC, you will be expected to become an active participant in our culture of assessment. This presentation will give you a quick overview of what assessment is and hopefully a few tips for completing those assessment data reports that are due at the completion of each semester. So let's get started. Before we talk about those assessment reports that you'll be composing, it's important to be familiar with what assessment actually is. The comic strip on this page illustrates a common problem facing teachers. We can say that we are teaching certain concepts and objectives. We can even list those items on our syllabi. However, how do we really know that our students are learning what we teach? That is where assessment is beneficial. Oakland Community College defines assessment as an ongoing process aimed at understanding and improving student learning. It involves making our expectations clear to students and setting appropriate outcomes for learning. It helps determine how well student performance matches articulated learning benchmarks and may suggest ways that curriculum and instruction can be improved. In simple terms, assessment is all about setting goals for our students, evaluating how well they achieve those goals, and then making changes based on those results. Even if you're not familiar with the term assessment, chances are you are probably already doing it on a regular basis in your classroom, in an informal way, if nothing else. Have you ever taught a lesson that didn't go over so well? Sometimes, with a few changes, we can adapt what we perceive as a failed lesson and redeliver it the next time with a higher rate of success. That is assessment. While it would be pretty near impossible to document every single assessment story throughout the academic year, it is important to record some of these because meaningful assessment values the numbers as much as the story. A typical assessment story identifies the object or what was looked at, an assessment tool, or describes how it was assessed. It lists results, provides an interpretation. It also provides an action plan and then feedback on that action, and describes what happened and details what the plans are for the future. Meaningful assessment also relies on clear learning outcomes that are specific and measurable. Within the past few years, faculty and staff at BRTC have worked diligently to create unified learning outcomes for all courses. Employers want to know what skills students are learning, not what classes they have taken. Learning outcomes provide students with the language to talk about their learning. Having unified course outcomes also aids in the collection of assessment data. Now you know what assessment is, it's time to look at those assessment data reports. Each semester, you will be asked to complete a course level or program level assessment data report for each class you teach. We call these the CLADRs or PLADRs for short. Now, if you teach more than one section of the same class, you can combine all of your information onto one report. So let's take a look at the information needed to fill out a CLADR. At the top of the CLADR, you will list course identification information. And then I'm going to circle these next 4 items because these are all items that you can take care of and enter in before your actually assessment activity occurs. So you can take care of these 4 items pretty early in the semester. First, you're going to list your course learning outcomes. Then you'll identify an assessment activity or activities for each outcome, and I'll give you some ideas for those a little later. After you've listed an assessment activity for each outcome, you're going to list a benchmark. In other words, what is your goal for meeting each outcome? Data location is a brief description of the physical location for where you intend to keep copies of your assessment activities and materials. And by the way, whatever assessment tools you select, please keep electronic copies if possible. For example, if I were going to use the narrative essay as an assessment tool, I would keep electronic copies of all those narrative essays submitted, and then I would describe the file name and data location. The final column, the assessment activity results, will be the location for where you report all of your assessment findings. And then the bottom portion of your CLADR gives you the opportunity to describe any action plans that you decide to take based on assessment results. Here's a sample CLADR that I submitted for my Freshman English 1 class last year. You'll see that the very first learning outcome is compose a clear thesis statement. Now, you can list more than one assessment activity per outcome, but keep in mind, you will have to record results for each activity that you list. I like to keep things simple, so I just listed one assessment activity, the argument essay. Pick an activity that is specific and will demonstrate understanding of that particular outcome. For example, you wouldn't want to list essays or quizzes in general because you would be tracking results for every single essay or quiz submitted. Like I said, I like to keep things simple, so I just chose a single assignment, the argument essay, for this particular outcome. My benchmark, or my hope for what students will be able to achieve, is that 75% of papers will include a clear thesis statement. Then for data location, I have simply put that I have saved all of my assessment information to a folder called 2018 CLADR on the desktop computer in my office. So after I collected and reviewed the argument essay in this class, I gathered my results. And I found that 79% of papers submitted scored an average of 2 or higher on that outcome, or in other words, those papers actually included a satisfactory thesis statement. If you're wondering how I figured up that percentage, I did use a rubric to help me calculate that success rate, and I'll show you how to do that a little later. So now we're looking at the second page of my CLADR from last year for the same English class. After I submitted assessment activities and results for each of my learning outcomes in that class, then I was ready to give a list of any proposed course revision that I decided to make based on those assessment results. And as you can see, after I reviewed my assessment results, I decided that I needed to spend a little more time working on thesis statements with my classes. My rationale for that revision was that my lowest success rate was for that second outcome, supporting a thesis statement. So for implementation date, I'm sorry, I'm making such a mess with these circles. You can see that the implementation date is the date that you decide to make whatever change you desire. And then you will be asked, did any of your learning outcomes change? And if so, state the new outcomes and if these changes were approved by the assessment committee. I did say yes there because we did have some outcome changes last year, but most likely you will just have to put no on this column because at this point, most of those learning outcomes should be pretty well set in stone. If your curriculum was significantly altered in any way, you would want to also list or describe that change there in that column. And then your final column is your plan of action for assessing results and the effectiveness of that change that you intend to make. So here are a few tips for assessment collection. My first tip is please remember that grades do not equal assessment. When you're selecting assessment activities, keep in mind that grades in general can be a flag, but do not really point to specific strengths and weaknesses of what students know or can do. A student's grade in a course or on a project or exam generally represents the student's performance on a set of aggregated knowledge and skills. My next tip is keep it simple. Like I said before, try to list just 1 or 2 measures per outcome. Don't say something like quizzes or something else in general, because that would mean you would be collecting data for every single quiz that you assigned. The next tip is don't feel like you fail just because a benchmark is not met. Because actually, when you don't achieve a benchmark, sometimes that's a good thing, because that actually gives you more material to work with when you're planning improvements for your courses. And then my final tip is use a rubric. Rubrics can be custom made to fit any desired assignment or learning outcome. And I'll show you an example of one of my rubrics on the next slide. So here's a sample rubric that I made for my freshman English 2 class last semester. You can see what I did was I went through and I listed all of my course learning outcomes. And then for each outcome, I reminded myself of which assignment I was using for the assessment activity. And for this first outcome, you can see my assignment was the argumentative essay number 1. So once I identified my assessment activity, I went through and I listed all of my students. I listed all of their paper titles. And then because that particular outcome was really trying to examine 3 different items, I went ahead and broke those apart and listed them separately. I went through and rated each paper on support, organization, and thesis. I rated each of those items using a scale of 1 to 3, with 1 needing improvement, 2 being satisfactory, and 3 exemplary. Once I rated each of those items, I calculated an average for each student and recorded that in the final column. And that was what I used to figure my success rate for that particular outcome. And you can see at the bottom, well, maybe you can see, I've marked on this so much you may not be able to, but at the bottom of each outcome, I would list my results. And I said here, 2 out of 3 papers scored an average of satisfactory or higher on this outcome. And whatever my number was, I would take that and convert it to a percentage to use on my CLADR. When pressed to prove that students are learning a specific skill set, teachers have physical evidence in completed CLADR or PLADR that shows which benchmarks have been met and what changes are being made and when. With documented assessment records, teachers can not only brag about what skills their students are learning, but they can also back up those claims with physical evidence. Because the goal of assessment is continuous improvement, the process never ends. If you have any questions about assessment, feel free to contact one of the assessment contacts at BRTC. Their information is posted here.